Hi and welcome to the channel. Today I want to talk to you, or should I say we want to talk to you. Yes, I'm not sure if you noticed, but today we have an extra pair of hands here. Someone from our community that stepped it up to collaborate with this sound design experiment. Today Gillam and I want to show you this experiment we've done together around sound design for continuous expression gestures instead of using envelopes for modulation. Our idea was to create a patch in Hydrasith that makes use of continuous expressive values transmitted, in my case, by the Osmose via MPE, then to adapt this same patch to be controlled by Gillam's Moog Claravox Theremin. This video will be roughly divided into 5 chapters, where first I will give you a little context around MIDI and MPE. Then I'll show you how I have configured Osmose MPE outputs and mapped those onto the Hydra. Finally, I'll teach you step by step how to reproduce this patch in Hydra, explaining my sound design principles there. And then Gillam will show you his solution to adapt the patch, but more than this, how to connect his Theremin to the Hydra. And stay with us until the end, where we will discuss a little bit about our experience with this experiment. But before we get started, let me give you some context. What we are experimenting with today is the property of MPE of transmitting key pressure as a continuum value. But what on earth is MPE? What are these values and where all this comes from? I cannot talk about MPE without talking about MIDI, which stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface. And without making the story too long, MIDI was essentially an agreement settled in the 1980s between different instrument manufacturers. This initiative started by Yukataro Kikahashi, the former president of Roland, and the Japanese manufacturer would approach different American manufacturers, finding in Dave Smith the partnership he needed to develop this new technology. And under Dave Smith's direction, an engineer called Chet Wood was the one proposing a cheap and easy way for different manufacturers to communicate between their instruments. Then in 1983 at NAMM show, Roland and Sequential would demonstrate their new concept by connecting a Prophet 600 with a Jupiter 6. I think one of the main use cases that motivated the MIDI protocol was the idea to connect or synchronize, for instance, a drum machine clock with a sequencer or an arpeggiator in a synthesizer, allowing the artist to trigger one instrument from the other and have all his instruments in sync. And the other use case is this idea that you have an infrastructure of different MIDI channels where one controller can actually transmit different MIDI information and a receiver will listen to a specific channel. This way, from the same controller, a musician could conduct a whole orchestral arrangement of instruments by transmitting the data into different channels at the same time. And each instrument will listen only to the channel that was controlling them. Now fast forward to 2018 and the MIDI Association introduces MPE, which makes use of this same infrastructure infrastructure in order to transmit polyphonic expressive data, which means if in regular MIDI you would transmit, for instance, pitch band from a controller, this parameter would affect all the notes you are playing at the same time, all of your instrument voices. But MPE, instead of transmitting different data into different channels, take the channels as a single instrument voice. With this idea, you can actually, for instance, pitch band each note individually. And manufacturers such as Expressive got very creative on creating new expressive controllers that interface with MPE and allow you, for instance, to do this banding by wiggling the keys of the Osmose. Now I want to show you a little bit of my setup in Osmose here. Despite of MPE being an industry standard, the technology is pretty new and the good practices are not yet mature. So it was not a surprise for me that different manufacturers will have different implementations of the standard, although they can still talk pretty much plug and play. What I mean by that, let me show you my first difficulty. In order to configure the outputs for the Osmose, I had to enter in the menu and choose to configure the parameters of MIDI here. When you see that things are not working as expected is when you should refer to the menu, but I tried the hard way, which is try and error. And thumbs up for Osmose and Hydrasith because it was easy enough to figure it out. What I had to do was to go to the menu adjust here and check which parameters Osmose was sending via MPE. And then what Expressive calls pressure in the user interface. It's actually the value you get when pressing a key between note activation and aftertouch. Hey, it's me from editing here. I think it's important to highlight that in all aftertouch compatible keybeds I had before, you would have to press the key all the way down until you reach the bottom, and then you would press it harder against the hard surface to achieve aftertouch range. Therefore, the feedback you get is of pressing harder against a hard surface. Whereas in the Osmose, aftertouch is also a key press range. So the key will easily move down until a point where you find a light resistance. It gets harder to press the key, but the key is still moving. And this is the moment in Osmose where you reach aftertouch. But there is still room for key travel, giving you much more fine control of the aftertouch range. This is pretty intuitive. However, when trying to read this value in Hydrasith, I could not find pressure. And after a lot of try and error, I realized that what Osmose was transmitting as pressure is read by ASM as polyphonic aftertouch. And this was very counterintuitive for me because if I look into what Expressive is transmitting as their aftertouch, the values were mapped to a MIDI channel here. After googling a little bit around CC74, the standard will point this as an MPE channel for the cutoff frequency of your filter, which makes sense. In many cases you would use aftertouch to open up your filters. However, if I roll down all the MIDI channels, you'll see that I actually have the value polyphonic aftertouch here. And after trying to map this into Hydra, what Expressive E calls polyphonic aftertouch is read into the Hydra as MPE Y-axis. The second thing that I have actually a hard time to map was the wiggling of the keys sideways. I knew that the Hydra would allow me to access different values of MPE in the mod matrix, such as the two versions of Y coordinate absolute and relative and the X MPE coordinate. And since I already found out that Y coordinate was mapped to the Osmose polyphonic aftertouch, I would only assume that the wiggling of the keys was my X-axis. But sometimes it would work as expected as a pitch band and sometimes not, depending on the patch in the Hydra. So what I had to do was to go all the way to sensitivity and reduce the resolution of my banding here to very low levels like 1 to 6. And this was when I could really perceive the changes in the X-axis and confirm that the pitch band with the wiggling of the key in the Osmose would map to MPE X value in Hydra. So I mean, far from being a Osmose tutorial here, Of course, you can learn with my mistakes. The main lesson is that even if there is a standard such as MIDI 2.0 or MPE, make sure to read the manuals and try to map what comes in and out of your devices, because different manufacturers may, for usability reasons, call these standard values with different names. And this is about the good practices that will come only with time, when many manufacturers will be compatible with these standards and agree in an harmonized names for all those parameters so that all users can easily understand. For those of you interested on reproducing this patch in your Hydra, or to learn the sound design principles I've used to build this patch, in this chapter I will show you in details how to reproduce it. The core of this sound design is this idea of using the continuum values from MPE controllers to modulate my sound sources here. In order to do so, the first step you should do is to go to your system setup, the button just on the left side of your screen there, and on page 5, I think, you'll find the MPE parameter. You should turn this on if you plan to use this patch with an MPE controller. You can skip that step if you will use other sources to control the patch. The second thing we have done here was to go to the voice menu and set our polyphony to mono. And this was already thinking of controlling the patch with the theremin, so we thought having it monophonic will work better for both systems. Remember that our approach here was really to isolate one of the many controls that you get with MIDI polyphonic expression. But now let's have a look at my sound sources. If I go to the mixer here, just to give you an overview, this is a timbre composed of 3 sound sources. So let's have a look at them. My oscillator 1 has a very peculiar waveform here. It is set to single mode and wave pulse 5. This is a waveform exclusive for Hydrasith and its wavetable capabilities, and my tuning was set to -24 semitones, so 2 octaves below my sensor tuning with a full key track. Let me show you how pulse 5 sounds like by going to the mixer here and soloing it. You can see here how the waveform is, and it's basically a rich harmonic waveform. So if you're reproducing this sound into another system, you might as well use Sawtooth and try to work your harmonics from there. Now returning my mixer here so you can hear all voices. Oscillator 2 then is set to also single mode, and the waveform is set to sine wave, tuned to -12 semitones, also in the lower octave, full key track. And this oscillator will act as the glue between oscillator 1 and 3 for myself. So sine wave will be this very flat harmonic, so that you can see here my oscillator 3. I also have one of Hydrasith specific waveforms called pulse 6, also tuned to 2 octaves below and full key track. So you have on top here pulse 5, oscillator 2, which will be that connection between the two, and oscillator 3 with pulse number 6. For those of you that are not familiar with the Hydra has this wavetable capability as well. So ASM has designed those wave families, and pulse is one of them. With the numbers, the idea is that you will swipe to the different wave families to create a specific timbre. And I'm making use of this sound design from ASM to build my own sound. Now let's talk modulation here. My mutants. Mutants are also a peculiar way that Hydra relates to some types of modulation. My only modulation in the mutants here is modulating oscillator 2, which is our sine wave. And here in mutant 3, I have chosen pulse width original with a ratio of 1, depth of 66 and a dry wet of 91. And you can see here in my ring modulation menu that source 1 for the ring modulation is oscillator 1 and source 2 is oscillator 2, and I'm using here ring modulation depth to 85.9 and the ring modulation volume to 89.5. I'm not using noise in this patch. So let's recapitulate here in the mixer what is the relation between our sound sources. Oscillator 1 is set to max volume of 128, oscillator 2 59.2, and oscillator 3 to a volume of 64.6, and the ring that we just saw with a volume of 89.5. If we now follow our signal chain here, we can have a look at our filters. Filter 1 is is set to a low pass ladder 12 dB per octave. My cutoff frequency is set to 54.8 and the resonance 55.6. Full key track for this filter, and the filter 1 will be connected in series with filter 2. So let's have a look at filter 2 here, following the signal chain, and this will be set to low pass, bypass, high pass with a morph of 67.2. This will put us more or less here on a band pass region with a cutoff frequency of 38, resonance set to 46.6. However, this filter is not being tracked by the keys, so I'm not making use of neither envelopes or LFOs for the filter here. And if I continue on the signal chain, let's have a look into the amplifier. And this is an important parameter here, because one of my design choices was to actually modulate the amplitude level using the MPE parameters. And for doing so, I had to set my amp level very low to 5.2 there, so that I don't clip when I play interactively with MPE. And this also means that I'm not making use of the traditional envelope to control amplitude. So if I go to the pre-router envelope here that controls the volume, you will see that this is set to on and off. Basically, it's just a trigger. If I now continue on the signal chain, on the delay section, I'm actually using LRC delay. My time is set to 392 milliseconds with a feedback of 43.9, wet tone 18.6, feed tone was left in 32, and the dry wet only 26.2%. And I'm also making use, if we continue here on the signal chain, of reverberation. The reverb I've chosen here is the plate with a pre-delay of 24.1 milliseconds. I've changed the time to 2.10 seconds, a tone of -43, high damp of 85.4, low damp set to 106.4, and dry wet 25.6. So this is to give this sound more space. And this is it for the signal chain. I have not used post-process effects. Of course, feel free to add your own spices there, but the effects were not needed other than creating space. But things starts to get interesting in modulation here. After some try and error exploring the variables that we were getting from MPE, those continue variables, my first idea was to make use of the wavetable capabilities of Hydrasith and maybe modulating the wave types. Maybe that's why I have all the pulse wave specifically from the wavetable sound design, but I wasn't getting to a cool place in that experiment. So what I decided to try out while talking with Gillam and brainstorming together was actually to try to modulate amplitude, forgetting a little bit about the time-based envelopes, to control our volume and modulation using pressure instead. And I mean, this was a lesson from the native patches in Osmose as well, that they made a lot of use of volume control connected to the pressure value of the keys. But you will see that there is more to the picture here when we look into our mod matrix. So let's jump into it without further ado. This is where the magic happens. Like I told you before, I had that initial problem of mapping the MPE values, although it was very much easy to find them on the mod matrix. But since Expressive have one name for the value and ASM will have another name, I had to, by try and error, map the parameters. In my case, both monophonic aftertouch and polyphonic aftertouch would work to map the pressure from Osmose into Hydra. But since my patch was monophonic, I actually decided to map monophonic aftertouch, and this is the first modulation that I told you about. What I'm doing here is using monophonic aftertouch to control the amplitude of my amplifier level to a value of 71.5. And this is why I had to set my amp values here so low, because on the mod matrix the levels could go pretty high as far as I press the key in Osmose. So this is what this patch is doing here. The second modulation also connected to aftertouch is pressure. The amount of pressure I put in the keys before aftertouch in Osmose, right? I know it's confusing, bear with me, but this is controlling the volume of oscillator 2. If you remember, oscillator 2 is my sine wave, is the glue between the two different pulse waves there, and it is a very low sound focused on the harmonic of the note that I press, right? So the more I press, the higher or more pronounced my harmonic will be. And this will of course affect the timbre of the sound, changing the balance of volumes between the three oscillators. Last but not least, on page 1, I'm also mapping the same key pressure to filter 2 cutoff frequency to a positive value of 39.2. If you remember, filter 2 is this band pass filter, which is positioned very low on the frequencies that is cutting off. So the more I press my key, the more I open the filter, and I will get a brighter sound. So now let's have a look onto page 2. Yet again, mapping the pressure from Osmose here to my mixer oscillator 1, but now what I'm changing is actually the stereo positioning of oscillator 1. So oscillator 1 is that pulse wave that gives me the buzz sound and probably the main timbre of my overall sound. And the idea here was to modulate the sound from the left to the right, and that's why I call the sound Lightsaber, as if this sound source was actually panning on the stereo spectrum the more I press the key, right? So you can see the effect left to right there. And this was my starting point with that thinking of modulating the stereo spectrum. Later on in the process, I realized that I'll need to also shift the panning of the other oscillators. But I continue sound designing, and that is when I thought of connecting LFO5 to my mixer oscillator 1 volume to a value of 117.8. I tend to use the LFOs from right to left here to make sure that I get the free ones first. So let's have a look at what LFO5 is doing to my oscillator 1 volume here. LFO5 is set to a sine wave at a rate of 3.66 Hz, not synced with a BPM, with a trig sync in polyphonic, and that's just because I left the original value there. You can work with monophonic there. And the level of the modulation is 46.1. So this LFO is raising and lowering the volume of my oscillator 1 at a frequency of 3.66 Hz. And this will give me a tremolo effect, basically. And that's because my intention was not to mimic exactly the sound effect from a lightsaber, but you can hear in this electronic sound that it buzzes, and I wanted to add this on and off feeling to the electronic sound, right? So that's what LFO5 is doing, but I also thought with a stereo or spatial effect, if this lightsaber is coming and whooshing by your ears, that oscillation of the saber that is still in space will actually decrease as it passes by. So that's why I actually mapped here MPE Y absolute to the rate of my LFO, to lower the rate of the LFO when I actually reach Osmose aftertouch. So bear with me here. What Hydrasith calls monophonic aftertouch is translated to pressure in Osmose, and the MPE Y abs is translated to the aftertouch in Osmose. So when I press my key down to aftertouch, I will have the stereo effect, this lightsaber moving towards your ears or passing through your head. And then when I finally reach the bottom, the first thing I'm doing here is slowing down the buzzing of this standstill saber, right? But this continues on to the next page, because here I'm mapping MPE Y absolute, again Osmose aftertouch, into the mixer oscillator 3 volume. And this is the transition that I mentioned in the beginning, where at first you will have oscillator 1 with a higher volume, more pronounced sound, and when this saber whooshes on the stereo spectrum, then you get oscillator 3 with the most pronounced sound in the timbre. And if you remember, oscillator 3 is that pulse 6. So you are doing this transition between pulse 5 and pulse 6 by actually raising the volume of oscillator 3 when I reach all the way down to aftertouch. So you can hear that it changes from the predominant pulse 5 into pulse 6. It's hard to reach aftertouch without pitch bending in Osmose. Anyways, the other thing here will be that MPE Y absolute, it's also affecting the amplifier level. And that's because the idea was that the spatial sound will come from left to right, getting higher and higher and higher, so closer to you. And when it reaches the end of the course, I had to dump down the volume a little bit, otherwise I will reach clipping there. Then if we now look into this last routing here. I'm routing monophonic aftertouch to my oscillator 2 panning as well. Like I told you before, I first started on the other page panning only oscillator 1, and after playing with the MPE Y values there, I realized that I was not getting the real stereo effect from the sound. So that's when I thought, okay, I need to bring on the other oscillators together, mapping the pressing of the key in Osmose, my monophonic aftertouch in Hydrasith, to oscillator 2 panning to a value of 107. And this gave the emphasis of the spatial movement I wanted to modulate just by pressing the key in Osmose. However, if I go to my last page here, I did the same of mapping pressure or monophonic aftertouch to the panning of oscillator 3, but in the opposite direction. So if you remember, oscillator 1 is my main sound while the pressure is low in Osmose. It's pulse number 5, supported by the sine wave on the root note that I'm pressing on the keyboard. So those two are panning left to right, and that's what we hear more pronounced. But in order to create this stereo spreading that you get at the end of the pressing of a key, I decided to actually move oscillator 3 into the opposite direction so that the stereo spread will increase as much as I press my key down. So in essence, this is it. This is how this sound was constructed. And you can see our approach here. I mean, there are so many ways to approach expressiveness from all the MPE values, but we try to simplify by focusing on pressure and focusing also in the aftertouch of the key. But now I want you to see how can this be translated to a completely different interface of the theremin. So let's see how Gillam appropriated and transformed this patch with this idea that one key press or one control that can be expressive is modulating both the amplitude, the volume of my sound, making this sound coming closer to the spectator, but also modulating the stereo movement and the stereo spread. Let's have a look.
As far as the settings for how the theremin is going to be controlling the Hydrasith. Right now, we have it set to quantize the pitch antenna to the scale of whatever song that we're playing. And then we have a note on and off that'll hit right about there. That is going to just trigger the MIDI note. As far as the actual expression component, that's still also going to be located on the volume antenna. That, however, is going to be a plus or minus 5 volt signal coming out of the CV jack. What I'm trying to do is emulate the control schema of the same patch with a different input and expression method, and contrasting the difference that creates in the end result. Rather than further adapting the patch to be fully optimized for the theremin, what we are doing on this patch is we are exploring different ways that you can use continuous forms of expression. Since these parameters are something inside the Hydrasith, you can actually access them in more than one way. You don't just need an MPE controller. You can use voltage control, as we're doing in this case, and MIDI. So one of the features of this patch is not using an envelope. This happens to be the main feature of a theremin, essentially. All you have on a theremin is a sustain level. That's it. You control that volume antenna. So when it comes to controlling the Hydrasith with the theremin, at a certain point, it'll trigger a note on. That note on is the only thing that this is sending over MIDI. The rest of what's being sent over is control voltage. We are losing part of the lower section of expression on this because it starts here, but we only get our note on here. However, once we trigger the note, we get the full expression, particularly of the Y abs in the original patch. Expression. We're going to do this with stickers from the weirdly expensive candy company. What we have when we go through one key press of the Osmose is two separate values being controlled one after the other. So even though we have a single motion from no value to high value, what's actually happening is we have two separate motions going on. So when you start pushing the key, you go through the first half, and then when you get to the aftertouch section, or what I believe is the Y ABS value, that's this next section here. We need to find a way to make my theremin do the exact same thing, or as close to it as I can. In this case, we can't get it exactly, but we can do something interesting. Because I can output a voltage from -5 volts to 5 volts, using the breadboard, whenever we run that through the diodes, we split the signal. And then, whenever we reverse the lead, we invert. So, what we got going on, the actual signal from the theremin is coming in on this red wire. It goes into this upper section here, where we have two diodes, this one and that one. They're both essentially pointing in the same direction, going that way. What ends up happening then is the positive voltage from the theremin goes to here through this red wire to the tip of mod 2. Because voltage is a difference value, the negative voltage, when you flip which lead it is, a red lead, the hot lead, and this black lead here, the negative voltage, you could think of it as going this way, even though what's really happening is a positive voltage is going that way from this point. So by flipping these two leads, we're essentially tricking mod 1 down here into thinking it's actually getting 0 to 5 volt when it's really getting -5 to 0. Now, you'll notice that means we got one slope going down and one slope going up. You're gonna get a different effect. So what we need to do with the Hydrasith is we're going to invert values. You'll see this whenever I actually go through my patch editing section. It's still not gonna get quite the same effect. Some of what we got going on as well is that whenever the note on the volume antenna triggers, we'll actually already be partway through this travel. It starts here, but we only get our note on here. But because we're going from a high value to a low value, what ends up happening is we'll still end up getting some use of this travel. It's just not going to be identical to what the original patch was. It'll be in the same vein though. Ideally, we would find a way to also invert this slope, but I can't do that without an active power source or some sort of voltage offset. What we're going to change about the patch to make it work with the theremin, but what we're going to do is we're going to replace the two values sent by the Osmose with mod 1 and mod 2. And all of the mod 1 values we're going to make negative instead of positive. Should be straightforward. All we're going to do is we're going to change the values of mono aftertouch and Y ABS to mod 1 and mod 2. Go to the menu, make sure to push this button or you will mess it up. Turn each of these to mod 1. That's done. That one's done. Go to our next page, mono aftertouch. Now for the MPE Y ABS or Y absolute value from the Osmose, we're going to be switching that one to mod 2. There we go. This one goes to mod 2, which is back. There we go. Mono aftertouch, and that will go to mod 1. Last one, mod 1. I'm going to save this just so I don't mess up. Save. There we go, back to the mod matrix. So now we're going to switch all of the mod in 1 values to the reverse of whatever they are, since the slope is reversed. It'll still be a little bit different than the actual patch because of the start and end points and the kind of like absolute position being different, but overall you're still going to get a similar effect. So we're just going to flip-flop anything that says mod 1 in. 71.2, mod 1 in 86.5, so we'll switch that to negative, mod 1 in 39.2, so negative 39.2. There's another mod 1 in, so switch this to negative 107. Mod 2, mod 2, mod 2, so mod 1, that goes negative 107. Last page, that was a mod in 1, so that goes to positive 107. And then we save the patch and we're good to go.
It was a lot of fun. At least for me, it was quite.
Oh yeah,
cool.
I had a great time. It was there were a lot of challenges. Basically, forced me to think about some things in different ways. The fact that I got an opportunity to give that a shot is nice.
I thought you were so clever at the same time, simple in your components to adapt the same idea for a complete different instrument that is very expressive using the Hydra as well. So thanks a lot for putting the effort on this. I think part of this experiment experiment is exactly this, like how do we integrate the Hydra with another controller or MIDI expression interface that we have. And we talked a lot about that even before we tried to engage together to do this experiment. But I thought it evolved so fast, your idea with the breadboard and everything. Have you thought about those things before our experiment, like playing with the Theremin and the Hydra? Have you done any tests yourself?
In that vein, too, it was a hack. No, we just have to be careful not to cause any damage to our electronics. That's the only real risk.
Oh yeah, we should have put a disclaimer. Don't try this at home unless you know what you're doing.
Yeah, you might wanna put that big danger. This was a complete hack. This is not the correct way to do it. I should have actually had a pedal power source and inverted the signal properly. There are ways to go about that, but I don't know how to do it off the top of my head, and I don't think I had all the parts for it. So I kind of improvised, and that's why there's going to be certain differences in the actual end result as well. Because like I said, with that slope inverted, the absolute value point of things is still different. So it ended up playing differently with how things panned out. It didn't sound bad, it was just different. Sometimes that type of a limitation turns out to be really interesting.
Our talk was always around expression. It was always around these continuous gestures and coming from Osmose. You were looking into it as well, and the whole idea with the Theremin. But then when I try to put it in the context of a musical piece, that's where I realized, okay, I'm gonna try stuff, you know. I was modulating a lot, I was knobbing a lot with the filter cutoff frequency on top of the modulations on the patch, the automation ones. But also the fact that I started with the arpeggiator actually surprised me, because all of a sudden the patch that was a lightsaber was saying pa.
Yeah, once you, because it's not quite a full-on transient, like an envelope, but it's like a pseudo envelope. It's the same thing that if you can pop the volume up quickly on the Theremin, you almost get like an attack. It's very hard to do, but it's kind of doable. I thought it was interesting where, although we're exploring the concept of continuity of expression without envelopes, the Osmose is just a hell of an instrument. But what it does is it provides maximal tactile feedback. You can feel your key presses, you can feel your pitch bend side to side. Everything is very tactile. You still have, albeit not with polyphony, but you still have those same expression options with a Theremin, but within a complete absence of tactile feedback. And that, I think, is an interesting contrast. And it kind of shows in the results a little bit. I think the parts where I was playing, you ended up putting a lot more reverb and making them seem more ethereal and creepy. And that is an inescapable component of what I think a Theremin ends up bringing to the table, just because of the lack of tactile feedback. I think it's fairly, like, even the most beautiful melodic players, there's almost always a haunting quality to the way a Theremin plays. Even when you're playing it digitally over MIDI, it still shows through. And I just think that's fascinating.
How was the overall experience for you with the patch in itself?
So as far as playing the patch itself, the quantized takes that I had where I was playing in scale with my pitch antenna were difficult. It felt like the instrument was fighting me the entire time. As much as it's weird to say that you're fighting air, I was fighting air, or really an electromagnetic field. Once I switched to having a continuous pitch, that's whenever you really start to get interesting results. Whenever I could crank what would be the aftertouch value by raising this volume hand while altering the pitch up or down, that's when I got some of my most interesting effects and sounds.
Thanks a lot.